Viola Davis said it best. The only thing that separates women of color from everyone else is opportunity. Have you given your Black employees the opportunity to demonstrate that they can do the job, that they can be successful? And have those opportunities been the same as the opportunities that you give your white employees or your non-minority candidates? Okay, good, because I got my little lights on, making sure everything is straight.
Yeah. Looking great. Thank you for dressing up.
Yeah. I figured, I don't get too many opportunities to dress up these days.
That's right. Well, I did shave today, so as you can see, it's fully shaved. So.
Too funny.
Well, listen, I'm already recording, so we'll just jump right in. But
okay.
I appreciate very much you joining me today on HR Talent and Insiders. I've been doing now a few episodes of this show, and it's an opportunity for me to network, connect with people. And, while some people have passions and they may play basketball or baseball or paint, this is my hobby. I enjoy talking to people. Yeah, that's right. Yes. So I appreciate very much you accepting to join me in my hobby, and hopefully we will do something productive today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Gustavo.
So, let me properly introduce you. So we have today with us Yvette Best. I'm looking at her LinkedIn profile, and Yvette is a fellow HR professional. But Yvette's main focus has been on the compensation, total rewards side of HR. And you have a great background. And I was looking, and you have a BA in Spanish.
I do.
I'm going to have to test you.
I did my undergraduate work at Michigan and did a study abroad my junior year for a summer. And, that was part of the requirements for the program that I was in. And,
Where did you go?
Sevilla.
Oh, so you were learning Spanish with the Spanish accent, Sabato, right?
Correct. I know the difference.
Yeah. Well, we'll talk about stereotypes, but one of the stereotypes whenever somebody hears me speaking Spanish, many times people say, "Are you Mexican?"
Oh, wow.
Yes. Mexico is the only Spanish-speaking country in the world.
Yeah, right. Sí, pero ninguno de mis amigos pueden hablar y por eso yo no tengo la oportunidad de practicar.
Look at that. So you know what? I was considering doing this in Spanish. So I think you're going to be my first guest.
I think I'd have a better delivery if we did it in English.
Okay. Got it. Well, but in looking at your background, obviously focus on the compensation side of things. Forgive me, the alarm just went off here. Focus on the compensation side of things. You have a BA from Michigan. You have an MBA from Rutgers, and you have a what would be this? Is it a PhD?
A doctorate in education and organization.
A doctorate in education. And it's focused on leadership and HR.
Correct.
Wow. I mean, impressive background. So I appreciate very much that you are here with me. But obviously, before we jump into the topic at hand, and of course, you're my first Black guest.
Okay.
I've had males, I have females. I don't believe that I have had any Latinos. But I was looking forward to having you as a guest, because not only you are the first Black guest that I have, I think even for males and females, but obviously it's such an important topic. And as you and I discussed prior to recording, there's a few areas that we want to discuss, and hopefully people will be able to learn. But before we do that, give us a little bit of your background, some of the companies you worked for, and what are you currently doing?
So I'll start with the current and work my way backwards. Right now, as an HR leader in transition, I am consulting. So
Hmm.
I've started an organization called Optima HR Development Solutions. And I did that back in 2016, kind of did it 2016, 2017 before starting with a railroad organization headquartered in DC, and have picked it back up kind of late 19, early 20. So in addition to the consulting side where I have experience, I've worked in the pharmaceutical industry, I've worked in aviation industry, consumer goods. When I first moved to Orlando, was working for a consumer goods company that had spun off. And so, I've kind of done multiple industries, hospitality industry, and each one of them brings its own set of unique challenges relative to kind of the corporate experience, but also being a Black woman in corporate America. And so a lot of that we see today in the media today with, the experiences, et cetera, I understand the struggle, but I know that it's been very different in each of the organizations, whether or not it's been a smaller organization, a larger organization, but just the diversity and how the organization values that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So obviously there's so many places that we can go with this conversation, but I think we've narrowed it down into a couple. And where I would like to begin is this concept of unconscious bias, right? That is becoming more and more a topic of discussion. As a matter of fact, a couple of weeks ago, I participated in a virtual session. And when you and I were discussing this, is that we agree that we all have biases, right? But in the case of race, in some cases, it's not unconscious bias what actually plays. Is true bias because the person or the individuals are aware. And that leads into what may be a blatant case of discrimination or treatment versus a subtle versus systemic. Tell us a little bit about how do you see as a Black woman in corporate America this concept of unconscious bias and how it has played out?
So we talk a lot about unconscious bias, but I agree 100% with what you've said, Gustavo, that sometimes it's not as unconscious as it's made out to be. I think when we spoke the last time, I had indicated that there are situations where at my most recent employer, happened to be one of the larger railroad organizations, which by the way has no African Americans on the senior leadership team until 2 weeks ago. And, I think in the wake of everything that's going on is probably the transition to that, but it remains to be seen yet what that's really going to mean for the organization. But in terms of unconscious bias, some of the things that I've had to deal with relative to unconscious bias is, or should I say the subtlety and not so unconscious is, I had a situation where I was on my second direct report, my second boss as the VP of HR. And our very first introduction, one of the things that she said to me was, "I hear you are blank." And that was, "I hear you are, aggressive or condescending in how you speak and, arrogant." And I'm like, wow, you and I have literally known each other for less than 3 minutes, but that's the first thing that you say to me. And then I had to think about it. From where would that come? Mm-hmm. And so the person who actually is responsible for being the, kind of on the fence individual and protecting the employee while at the same time protecting the organization was the HR business partner. And I always said, as myself as well as several others in human resources, that the HR business partner should not be a member of the HR leadership team, because right there it sets up some level of bias in and of itself in terms of how decisions are made, their availability to information, et cetera. And so it played itself out over, a couple of year period whereby you realize that the same things you're saying and doing are being evaluated totally differently by others of a different race, others of a different gender. And so then you start to question, well, is it really unconscious
Mm.
Or is this plain blatant racism? Or is this plain blatant stereotyping? And so those are the things that, on a day-to-day basis, you're constantly watching and monitoring the things you say and or do so that they're not misinterpreted. And that over time begins to wear on you, because you're not only doing your job, that you think you're doing successfully, but you also have the struggle of having to deal with not offending someone and their sensibilities. And, I liken it to one of those situations where individuals have to stop and be a little more self-reflective on, why is it that this person bothers me so much? Why is it that this group of people bothers me so much? Is it that I have these biases? And as you said, we all have biases, but how they manifest themselves in the workplace is where issues become, sort of troublesome.
Yeah. Well, as I hear you, and as I reflect on my own career, right, and the people that I've worked with, my most recent experience, I worked with 2 Black women. It was the first time that I can think of that I had direct reports, but not only direct reports to that level of immediacy, but that were at a level where they were opening my eyes to, right? Both of them parents, both of them moms. And one of the things that I learned, that it's what you just said, is maintaining a certain level of behavior, because if you get out of what is perceived to be the appropriate behavior, then it becomes a reflection of the stereotype of what Black people might be in the eyes of many. So, for example, you and I talked about this concept of the angry Black woman.
Right.
I don't know where it comes from, right? But as I am reading and as I'm watching more videos, there's a theme that you can pick up very easily from entertainment, politics, where you see these trends. But do you know where that comes from, and how is that holding you from the day-to-day, from being able to be who you are?
So I don't know from whence that stereotype comes. I do know that it's prevalent in, workplace environments, particularly in a corporate environment. But quite honestly, it's also prevalent in social settings. You'll hear friends, African Americans, as well as non-Blacks, using that same expression. And so it's something that's been embedded in culture generationally. From whence it originated, I don't know. How it manifests itself in a day-to-day basis is kind of like what I said, that you have situations where you want to respond in kind the way someone else has responded, but you can't, because the translation of your doing so versus a non-Black person doing so will be interpreted very differently. And so you have the mindset of, let me stop, pause, think, write it down, and then subsequently follow up after the fact. And so you're constantly thinking about what your words are and how those words are going to be translated and interpreted. There are several situations where, in meetings, the white female would be very emotional about a topic. I would sit in silence and not say anything, although I had lots to share on that very topic, but I didn't want my response to be misinterpreted as being angry, when in fact it was something that I was passionate about. So I would just simply take a step back and wait for the room to either calm down or follow up with a response in writing, so that my response verbally would not be misinterpreted. The downside to that is that I've been told that sometimes my writing comes off as condescending. And so at the end of the day, you write an email out and then you hit the backspace button. You write an email out and you hit the backspace button, because you're thinking about, well, what is the tone of this email? How will this email be interpreted? But at the end of the day, each time it was simply stating the facts. So there was never any emotion in it other than I'm telling you the same thing I've told you before. Here are the steps we've put in place that haven't been adhered to, etc. But again, a lot of that is misinterpreted as being angry or yelling, when in fact it's simply, no, I'm simply stating the facts and repeating what has already been said, but I'm doing it, in such a way. And so again, that wears on you. That has a tendency to, in addition to the daily workplace stuff, the constant thinking about how you're being viewed will have its negative impact as well.
So I think maybe 2 years ago, I watched a video. It was supposed to be a funny video where this young woman, a young Black woman, comes out, and I think she's in an interview, and they change different characters. And when her character comes, she says something along the lines of, well, now for the next 20 minutes, I'm going to use my white speech so that you feel comfortable with me, right? And she over exaggerates it. But it drives a point of what, many consider what would be a framework of what is appropriate or not. So for example, when I started working in hotels, the whole concept of dressing professionally, following certain guidelines was expected, right? So I had to wear a suit, a tie. If I was in the main areas of guests, I needed to have my jacket. Your hair as a male needed to be short above the collar. It couldn't be long. You couldn't have an earring. And I remember, seeing Black young men that would come and apply, and we would have to tell them, you need to cut your hair, right? Yeah. And it's all behind the concept of, well, you have to look professional, right? So the concept is that short hair becomes the acceptable norm of what professional is. Same thing for women. You couldn't have extreme colors. Well, what is an extreme color? Well, if you're a Black woman and you decide to bleach your hair, that's considered extreme. Therefore, you can't do it. But yet, depending on the cultural background of the individuals, that definition of professionalism might be different. And I guess my concern with that is that a lot of people may hide behind that without really considering what becomes then systematic, right? Because in my view, systematic is not necessarily the sit down of individuals and being told, this is what Black people look like. You cannot accept it from Black people, and you can accept it from whites, right? Or minorities. I'm sure that happens with certain groups, but what happens most of the time is we accept a certain framework and we take it for what it is. So short hair, that's the definition of professionalism. Long hair, you can't have it. Right. How have you seen that being then manifested, where now you have to not only play that role, but you can be who you are, but more importantly, those same biases are now influencing the performance review, right, the compensation increases that you may get, the promotions, and just the relationships on a day-to-day basis.
So in terms of the, kind of appearance aspect of it, you and I had talked previously about, kind of the whitewashing of the Black woman in corporate. And, relative to our hair, for example, classic example, if we wore our hair in its natural state, that would mean it looks like, it's anti-gravity. It would be big.
Yes.
Hairstyles like mine that, natural updo would not have been viewed the same, say, a decade ago. Kudos to states like California that have put in place anti-discrimination laws relative to how Black folks wear their hair. However, I haven't had much of that to deal with in corporate settings. It's always been in the back of my mind that, straight is better than it's in its natural form. However, I have taken the stance that I have to be true to me, because it's not about what is on the outside versus the knowledge that you're hiring me for. And so while I'm never disrespectful of the norms of the office, again, it's about being true to who I am, and wearing my hair in its natural form is a means of being true. The second piece of your of your question or statement is critical. As you mentioned, my background is primarily in compensation and total rewards. And I think a lot of what we talked about before relative to unconscious bias, et cetera, plays itself out in the decisions that are made relative to performance review. Because if you have these biases, whether or not it's, a halo effect and you love someone simply based on something that they did for you within that short term, or, kind of the opposite of that in terms of you had a negative experience right before performance reviews, that's going to manifest itself. Where organizations and management and leadership seem to forget is that performance review then drives so many other decisions about an individual's movement within the organization. It's going to have an impact on their compensation, whether or not it's a matrixed compensation structure or a sliding scale based on your rating. The only time it doesn't come into play is when organizations do across the board increases, where everyone, regardless of the rating, gets the same thing. Mm-hmm. But then you think about it from a career development standpoint. They go back then and look at, well, let me look at the history of this individual's ratings. If the ratings are low, that's going to then bump them from the ability to move up and their promotional opportunities within the organization. And so it poses multiple challenges, from a pay standpoint, from a career and professional development standpoint, from promotional opportunity standpoint. And, I look at, my last organization, and they have this program called High Potential, High Performer. But it was always difficult to assess what is the real criteria around who is considered a high PO. It wasn't clearly defined. You would have some people who were new to the organization and had not yet demonstrated their skills and expertise. Then you would have people who were long tenured, oftentimes people of color who had been there for a significant amount of time, had demonstrated their level of expertise, but were nowhere on the list, were nowhere in the conversation, and were not considered part of the successors to the leadership roles. You start to wonder, well, what is it about the process that has you not looking at the talent that has already been demonstrated? And again, what biases are playing into your decision-making about how an individual is classified as a high potential, high performer versus those who are not, because the criteria did not seem consistent and was not the same. And so, I think one of the things that organizations, have to do, it's one thing to put out, these communications that they're, donating significant amounts of dollars and that they're committed to making changes when they're within their organizations. But at the end of the day, when the rubber meets the road, what does your organization leadership look like? Have you taken a true look at your individual policies from a promotional standpoint, et cetera? Because those are the things that, or individuals within your organization, particularly Black individuals, are going to, kind of gravitate towards. I think one of the things that has happened, and there's been a study on this, that Black Americans have lost kind of the headway that we were making for some time when we got grouped into the persons of color category. Because then you're looking at, well, we are making headways with Asian Americans, with Middle Easterns, with Latinx, employees. But you're not looking at each one of those segments individually in terms of how you're moving the needle relative to Blacks or African Americans within your companies. And I think it's one of those things, and I can't remember, Viola Davis, she said it best. The only thing that separates women of color from everyone else is opportunity. Have you given your Black employees the opportunity to demonstrate that they can do the job, that they can be successful? And have those opportunities been the same as the opportunities that you give your white employees or your non-minority candidates? And that's the piece that, organizations really need to start to look at. We can do more as African Americans within organizations than be your diversity and inclusion head. And, oftentimes that's where you see us and they think they're making headway by doing so. When in fact, it's like, yeah, no, we actually have a broader skill base than that, with a lot of transferable skills to do a lot of other things.
Yeah. I mean, certainly the D&I movement today, as we speak today, I wonder how many organizations are out there just behind the scenes saying, right, just find me a Black person to put on the D&I and, to appease, right? Now, rarely are people going to come out and speak in that manner. It's usually behind the scenes.
But you know what? It's that blatant, but it's behind closed doors. Yeah. And at the end of the day, some of the most successful D&I individuals are not people of color. Yeah. There have been very successful white females, white male, et cetera, who are diversity and inclusion executives and doing quite well in that role.
I spoke about this with somebody else. We were talking about a different topic, but, to me, the concept of inclusion became much more transparent in my mind the last 3 years, because we would talk about diversity, but I think the term inclusion is so important because it's about including, right? Correct. So, I grew up with an aunt who was paraplegic, and I'm told that my grandfather did not attend a party to where he was invited because the invitation came to his name, his wife's name, and 2 of the 3 kids that he had, because they didn't invite the quadriplegic child. And he went, gave the gift, but did not stay. And he said, look, I have 3 kids. I don't have 2. Right. So the concept of inclusion has somehow played a role in my life. But I also have to admit that as a natural instinct, I gravitate towards what I'm comfortable with, what I know, be it, Latinos, right? When I look at my circle of friends, the people that I truly consider friends, they're all Latinos. Now, I did try to accommodate small things in comparison to what others of Latin heritage or Blacks have had to do. For example, people would say my name and they would go, how do you pronounce it? And I said, just call me Gus, right? Again, he's giving in and saying, I'm going to make it easier for you. And it comes a point that if people are not conscious of how they're asking others to adapt, which I understand there's a time and a place, right? Like I tell my kids, there's a time and a place. But when is that time and place now impacting your ability to grow, your ability to get promoted, your ability to be seen in a different light? And that's where my concern comes, that as a passive participant where, I've seen situations where I go, is that? Right. I opt to go the route of, I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt, right? And some people are saying, no, you call him on it.
Correct.
But here you are, a Black woman in corporate America. If you start calling on them, you know that there could be consequences to that. And that's where the concept of the angry Black woman comes. And then, no, you cannot give him an opportunity. All of these plays in my mind, and I have to be conscious that I need to figure out a way to stop being a passive participant. And perhaps I'm not going to be the aggressive one, but I have to be a little bit more vocal. What do you have to say?
So I agree 100% that we can't be passive on it. And, despite the current atmosphere and environment that we're living in, I would have answered the same way had you asked me this 10 weeks, 10 months, 10 years ago, that we have to speak up and call folks on it and, do it in the most professional manner and continue to document. You mentioned inclusion and the situation with, your grandmother, great-grandmother, but we have to look at inclusion beyond just the race component, and the same with diversity. So it's diversity of thought. If you have a room full of people and everyone thinks the same, then you're going to get these homogenous ideas that don't stray from the norm. The beauty of having a diverse group of people in the room is that you're getting different perspectives. You're sharing their experience. They're bringing their experience to the table. And that may happen whether or not you're at the leadership level, the middle management level, or the entry level. But what's critically important is you get everyone in the room together to share their ideas. In terms of speaking up versus speaking out versus, the passive or aggressive, I agree that there's a time and a place for it. And that time, as far as I'm concerned, is always. So listen to what's going on in the room. And that's critically important. And so it may not always be that you're speaking up against something or speaking out is against the idea. It may be, I'm sharing my perspective on this. But what we fail to do and fail to realize is by constantly being silent, it's only perpetrating the system that we want to change. It's only continuing to narrow the perspective of how we can make decisions. I mean, at the end of the day, no one organization is going to move forward and thrive unless we continue to bring in a lot of those diverse perspectives in terms of how we can move the needle, grow our business, whether or not it's, increase sales or be more innovative thinkers, et cetera. We have to speak up. We have to have a voice. We all have a voice. We all have been through multiple experiences in our careers that can help shape the current role that we're currently in and help the organization grow, whether or not it's, grow internally in terms of how we're valued by the internal employee base from an engagement and productivity standpoint, or whether or not it's bringing on new clients and new vendors from an external perspective. One of the things that I recently learned was that a former colleague had a situation where an external client decided that they were going to communicate with the internal leadership that they did not want to work with him because he's an African-American male. And so rather than address that external client, they pulled the internal employee off of that case.
Yeah. And
that sent a very powerful message to him. It can be very demotivating. It can be very demeaning because at the end of the day, it's, well, you don't respect me enough as a man, as a Black man, as an employee within your organization to stand up to that level of blatant racism and say, that's not how we do business. You will work with this person, or you will find someone else within your organization who will, but this is the most experienced person and we're keeping him on, on the case or on the situation. It's situations like that organizations don't realize where they think they are doing the right thing, the harm it's doing to their employee base.
Well, but when I consider that scenario, which I think is probably more prevalent, I think organizations, but ultimately individuals, because organizations are made up of individuals, individuals will find a way. I've always said that individuals, you and I will find a way to justify pretty much anything that we are interested in, that we want, or that can serve to protect ourselves. So I can see those individuals in that environment talking to this Black man and probably going, but it's okay. We're gonna give you another account. Don't. Right. This is not a reflection of you. This is a reflection of the other individual. Right. Okay. But where is now a reflection of you, Mr. and Mrs. Organization, because you are accepting something that shouldn't be accepted. And if you want me to feel, number one, that you have my back, two, that you want me to be loyal, now you are somehow saying, oh, it's not you, it's them, but somehow you're allowing it. And I think that plays a lot. I mean, and it may not have been race related, but you combine it with personality, you combine it with, levels. But when it comes to things like race, gender, it's very hard to somehow, for him to walk away and say, you know what, they're right. They're right. I should just step away. Why?
Right.
Why?
And they shouldn't have to, because at the end of the day, it goes back to how inclusive are we saying we want to be? You know, where we've, you know, just initiated a diversity and inclusion department of one with zero budget. And we're saying that we're going to do all of these things,
Yes.
but then the very nature of what we say we're going to promote as an organization, we throw in the face of, well, there are limits to this diversity and inclusion thing.
Yeah.
And that flies in the face of all of it. So,
yeah. I look, I certainly did not intend for this conversation to be a solution. But I genuinely wanted to begin the conversation, but it's so fascinating, having been in the corporate world like you, how we just fool ourselves into thinking that what we're doing is the right thing to do, right? Call it survival, call it whatever you want. But there are times when you have to call a spade. And that's why I understand, you know, people that perhaps like me, that I'm more, you know, I learned from my mother, single woman. My mother was not good at collecting money, at collecting debt. She had a lot of money on the street, but she only collected what she needed because confrontation was it's just the way that she's wired. Mm-hmm. So when difficult situations would come, I would see my mom kind of keep it in, right? With my father, I saw it. So when I see situations, I go, okay, how can I find an angle, still get to where I want to go, but let me find another angle. And some people say, Gustavo, I'm tired of the angle. We need to call a spade a spade. You should have not pulled that black man from that account. That is inappropriate. It sends the wrong message. And we should be ashamed of the fact that we are here behind closed doors, justifying it to make ourselves feel better. But he'll be okay. He'll be okay. That's what we say to make things better. One of the topics that you and I discussed is, hold on, I lost it here. The backhanded compliments, which after you and I spoke, oh my God.
The OMG, Yvette, you know, after a presentation, you were very articulate. And my response is, but what did you expect? I never understood that one. That one, you know, that is probably one of the most prevalent, is the how articulate, how well spoken, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, to me, that has never been a compliment. I find it quite insulting and condescending that you would think that I would be anything other than.
Yes. Yeah. And, but again, here we go again. In the mind of the person saying it, they're thinking, right, in some cases, but I'm paying you a compliment. That's your justification for what you have just articulated, because the reason you articulated, let's say that the person says, wow, you're very articulate. Compared to what?
Right.
What are you using as the standard?
But I think it goes back to what we said earlier, Gustavo, and that is what images are shaping our mindset around some of these stereotypes. And so is your knowledge base of how one speaks based solely on movies or television or entertainment, et cetera, versus the experiences that you have with educated folks within a corporate setting or higher education, et cetera. And so it goes back to, you know, that earlier conversation we had with what is shaping your mindset around an individual and or a group of people. But I also think that, you know, one of the things that we haven't really touched on, but goes back to, you know, kind of the diversity and inclusion and why it's okay for a leader to pull someone off of an account who has been successful with prior folks on that account, it has to do with org culture. And I think the fact that, you know, kind of a lot of the culture, the way individuals interact within an organization, particularly the leadership and management employees, has to do with the culture that's being pushed down from the top level. they've made it okay to say, you know what, we're going to pull you off versus let's address it with the external vendor. And that is what has to change in many organizations. And so while internally strides may be made, or externally, we've got all of these voices out there now talking about what we're going to do, and the dollars that they're throwing at it. What are you doing to actually change the org culture, which then changes the mindset, which then becomes embedded in the everyday interactions with people within your organization and externally to your organization? Because the flip side of that is there may be situations where someone internal doesn't want to work with someone external simply based on what they look like.
Yeah. So a few years ago, I don't know if you're familiar with Soledad O'Brien, a reporter. She did a few episodes on Black in America. Mm-hmm. And I remember watching it, and at the conclusion, she says something along the lines of, you need to go out there and reach out. You need to get to know, Blacks and Latinos and Asians. And I remember watching it, and I'll be very honest with you. I said, but I'm not a racist. Why do I have to go out there as a way of showing that I'm not a racist? And it took me a while to process that. Because it's not about being racist, but it's about acknowledging that without the outreach, my circle will remain the same and will not be exposed to other things that are absolutely appropriate, absolutely to the same or better standard that I may be perceived, but more importantly, will not allow me to understand what others are going through. And here I am years later, hearing the conversation, and the first thing that I do when this comes out is say, I got to reach out to someone. Where perhaps a few years I would have said, I'm not a racist. I don't have to reach out to anybody, right? That's probably the mentality of some individuals out there. They immediately go into this cocoon of saying, I'm not a racist, right? I have a Black friend. I have a gay friend, right?
Oh, do you know how many times I've heard that?
But now it's thinking beyond, right? If words matters, intentions also matter. And I think, and I'm hoping that organizations that are moving in this direction, beyond any money that they may give, you have to be willing to listen. You have to be willing to put it out there and just listen.
And that's it. And oftentimes we don't stop to listen to understand. We listen to respond. And it's the response that's not needed. You have to dig deeper to understand the root cause of much of what's going on. And, as HR professionals, we know all too well. I mean, take something as basic as a sexual harassment claim. And, you've got the employee, whether or not they're male or female, Black or white, whatever, that comes forth and says, I think I've been sexually assaulted, or there's been a situation of sexual harassment. Immediately you want to jump in and start to act and respond. Whereas it's a matter of stopping to listen to the circumstances beyond why that person feels they have been sexually harassed. Mm-hmm. What are the actions that led up to that? What was said that led up to that? And so, as HR professionals, I think we do, probably a better job of listening than many others within the organization. But it's oftentimes a situation where we also fall flat, where we're not ready to listen to the root cause, because, at the end of the day, if I had $1 for every time I had a conversation with my last organization, excuse me, with the VP of HR, my AVP to whom I directly reported, with the EVP about the situation that was going on internal to HR, I'd be wealthy. But it falls on deaf ears when they only want to hear what they want to hear, but are not listening. Yeah. And it's not until you've turned in your letter of resignation that now they're ready to listen, that now they see exactly what you were talking about for the last 2.5 years. And so that's a challenge. And I think that, one of the things that we need to do as organizations and leaders within organizations is just quiet. Take a moment to listen, whether or not it's focus groups, but you can't have these engagement surveys that you conduct once a year and try to take action on that. And so, many organizations probably conducted an engagement survey in 2019 and are developing an action plan in 2020. Well, you can throw that all out the window, because 2020 has reshaped and redefined what employee engagement looks like. 2020 has reshaped and redefined what the employee voice sounds like. It has reshaped and defined so much of human resources. And we are, as HR professionals, the new first responders. There has never been a greater time for the HR leader to shine than now.
Wow. It's interesting because I did not see it in that manner, but there's a gentleman that posted, saying something along the lines, this is not necessarily the HR, the year of HR, right? It wasn't meant to be, but somehow it's playing out in that manner because you have COVID, then you have these race relations and social injustice movements. So here we are as HR professionals right smack in the middle.
Right.
Like it or not, good, bad, or indifferent, what are you going to do? Exactly. And this is, to me, where I would like to conclude, not only in terms of the listening, but for me, the systemic issues, in this case of race, stem in many instances from comfort and from fear. Yes, we sometimes hear what somebody says and we go, but the fear of confronting it sometimes is too great because we go in that cocoon and we want to protect ourselves. I am glad that there's people out there that are willing to put themselves out there and say, nope, we got to stop it. And I hope that I can become a much more vocal voice. I don't believe that I am perhaps an extremist in that regard, but I can't be the passive individual that just looks at it and tries to somehow justify it, because there's such thing as having allies. And in this case, we need to be more vocal when those injustices are happening, but more importantly, understanding why they're happening rather than drawing a conclusion simply because we're looking at them through our lens. Right. and nothing else.
Right.
So, Yvette, I appreciate very much you coming out. Is there anything else that you wish to add?
No, I think we've, pretty much covered it all, Gustavo. I think that, your closing comments are critical in that, in addition to the listening, in addition to understanding the root cause, it starts with our talent acquisition. So organizations have to really dig deep into what are our hiring practices? What is our promotional strategy for all employees? What policies and procedures do we have in place for employees and for their voices to be heard without the fear of retaliation? Because oftentimes that's why employees are silent, is they fear what the outcome is. And you mentioned fear, but in a different respect. I think it's fear in terms of, how is this going to be viewed and how am I going to be treated after speaking up? And so a lot of that goes back to what I said before. What is the culture that we have in place that allows employees to openly communicate without the fear of retaliation? And, it's subtle. So oftentimes it's not going to be an obvious, blatant, oh no, you're not being promoted or you're not being considered for the next opportunity because you spoke up. It's your name has now been moved off of the high poll list. Yeah. You've now been put into this bucket of, they're kind of troublesome. But, we have to look at, as organizations, are we doing ourselves a huge disservice by having different sets of criteria for different people? Again, as a comp person, we have to be fair and equitable, and we have to manage equally across the board, address the developmental opportunities for an individual, praise the, things that they're doing well, but there has to be consistency and fairness in those practices.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate very much you coming out here and sharing your thoughts. You know, I learned with our initial conversation and certainly refreshed some of those topics today. And like I said, if there was something that I made a conscious choice in the last 3 years was as a head of HR was I'm here to enforce policies and procedures, put programs, but I also want to incorporate that human aspect. And I use the phrase of life happens. We can't forget that life happens. So when I put it in the context of race relations, life happens differently for others.
Correct.
Just because I had it in this way doesn't mean that others had it that way. Maybe they should. Maybe that's part of the conversation. But until we acknowledge that is different and why it's different, I think we're going to go to build walls that are just not helping anyone. So, Yvette, I appreciate very much you coming. Muchas gracias.
De nada.
So, obviously, you guys can connect with Yvette. She's active on LinkedIn. And like she said, she has her own consulting firm, but obviously is also looking to land somewhere on a full-time basis. Great background on compensation and total reward, including global coverage in that regard. So I appreciate having someone with your pedigree and caliber, and we'll remain in touch.
Thank you. Be true to you. Thank you, Gustavo.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.